I believe that God is present here and will speak to us again today. There is a novel by Albert Camus called The Plague. It was actually a very famous masterpiece from the start, but it gained intense global attention when it coincided with the COVID-19 pandemic. As a result, the book's message has been conveyed with much greater depth and weight. To briefly summarize the main plot, there was a city called Oran in French Algeria. At that time, the plague, a deadly infectious disease, suddenly spread through the city. Consequently, the city was instantly locked down and people lived through a time of disaster, cut off from one another. Camus portrays with great delicacy how humans collapse, how they endure, and how they interpret and survive that time during that long, dark period. There are expressions in this novel that keenly capture and portray the characteristics of a time of disaster. I would like to introduce just two of them. There is a sentence that reads, "The characteristic of the plague is that it starts over from the very beginning." There is the famous punishment of the boulder Sisyphus in Greek and Roman mythology. When he struggled and struggled to roll the boulder up to the top of the mountain, suddenly the boulder would return to its starting point. It is being separated. Having to endlessly repeat this was the punishment of Sisyphus. However, this expression suggests that the time of the plague is similar to this very punishment of Sisyphus. It means that no matter how hard you try to change something or how desperately you struggle to create meaningful change or progress, the destructive power of the disaster itself is so strong that it creates a situation where you are forced to start over and over again from the beginning. It is just like during the COVID era. Whenever we tried to do something within the church, a second wave would come. And just when we thought we had finally made some meaningful change, a third wave would strike, resetting all our efforts. Therefore, the characteristic of the time of disaster is that it ultimately causes the human spirit to be consumed by fundamental meaninglessness and emptiness. And there is also this expression, let me read it. Terrible misfortune is monotonous because it drags on. The terrible days of the plague do not appear like a cruel and massive fire, but rather like an endless stalemate that crushes everything placed beneath one's feet. What this means is that the plague, which blazes fiercely for a moment, if it were raging like a wildfire, we could escape by demonstrating a powerful will and displaying heroic courage in that single moment. However, the time of the plague unfolded monotonously, like a swamp that slowly sucked in everything beneath our feet over a long period. As this prolonged time passed, people's emotions and thoughts became extremely parched and dry. If we compare this to the COVID-19 era, we were heartbroken and reacted sensitively to the number of confirmed cases and deaths in the beginning, but as time went on, we accepted all those numbers and situations with numbness, and our daily lives flowed by monotonously day after day. However, the terrifying aspect of this numbness and monotony is that it slowly robs people of their imagination and makes despair and cynicism become habits. The book describes this as the horror of a time of disaster like the plague. As such a time of disaster unfolds, a doctor named Liu appears as one of the book's protagonists. However, amidst this time of disaster, which is like a giant swamp, the things this Dr. Liu can do are extremely limited. His assigned duties, even though one handles the situation faithfully and with the utmost effort, dramatic cures do not occur in a situation where the plague has already spread helplessly. Most of the time is spent merely repeating very basic treatment procedures like a machine, and the majority of time is filled with diagnosing diseases and pronouncing death. As we read the book, I felt that Albert Camus poses a profoundly important question to the reader through the character of Liu. It is a question like this: what meaning can Liu's actions hold amidst such a time of disaster? It is a time when, no matter how hard one tries, it feels like starting over from the beginning with no visible fruit or result. In those times of despair that suck up all hope like a swamp, can we say that the sense of calling this character possesses, the time he spends and the time he builds up, hold any meaning or value? I think we can consider this a very important question that touches upon the core values regarding one's calling. There is a book that raised this question, or the critical awareness posed by the novel The Plague centuries ago, specifically the Book of Essays, which we have been examining since last week, and among them the one we are looking at today. The text we will be examining is the record of chapters 2 and 3. As you know, the book of Ezekiel is a book about God's word and visions proclaimed during the time of the great disaster known as the Pharaohs. Chapters 2 and 3, which serve as today's text, are known as the chapters of Ezekiel's calling. The word and promises of God, who called Ezekiel as a prophet and gave him his vocation during a time of disaster, are recorded in this section. When we look at these chapters of calling and imagine the scene of God giving a person a calling, certain romantic images seem to automatically come to mind. For example, scenes like this: a deeply moving calling, a glorious promise that awakens a sense of mission, and beautiful, willing obedience offered in the face of that promise. Surprisingly, if you read Ezekiel's chapters of calling today, none of these images appear at all. On the contrary, they are filled with very bleak and dark tones. There are several recurring expressions in chapters 2 and 3 of the calling chapter. First, there is verse 3. It would be good for us to read this verse together in one voice. He said to me, "Son of man, I am sending you to the Israelites, to a rebellious nation that has rebelled against me. They and their ancestors have sinned against me to this very day. The nation I am sending you to is a rebellious people." The expression rebellious people is repeated as many as 8 times in just the short sections of chapters 2 and 3. Here, this rebellion does not refer to a momentary deviation. Rather, it describes a state that has become hardened over a long period of continuous resistance. In other words, the word rebellion does not simply mean a one-time act of disobedience, but rather a state in which hearts have been closed off to God for a long time, resulting in broken and distant hearts. That is a more accurate description. From God's perspective, no matter how many times it is repeated and emphasized, it is clear that the audience Ezekiel will encounter are people whose hearts have become hardened and stubborn. And there is another expression that is repeated. It is stated like this in verse 7. Let me read it for you. "Whether they listen or not, you must deliver my words to them." Deliver the message whether they listen or not. This expression is also repeated continuously. What does this mean, everyone? It means that there will be hardly anyone who truly listens to the words Ezekiel delivers or who responds meaningfully to Ezekiel's ministry. To summarize, the core message God is repeating to Ezekiel now that he has called him is these things. From now on, I will raise you up and send you out, but the people you will face will be hard-hearted individuals who will never be favorable toward you. The times you face may be filled with emptiness. The situations you encounter may be filled with landscapes where it is rare to see any fruit or meaningful change. I am sending you to such people, to such times, and to such situations. As I read and meditated on these words, my heart felt so heavy I kept thinking, isn't God being too cruel? Where else can one find such a calling and such a vocation? Although I cannot ultimately compare myself to Ezekiel, I did have a very small indirect experience. When I was a college student, I participated in various ministries in a praise club at school. The ministry I wanted to avoid as much as possible back then was ministry at military bases. It was a ministry where men were absolutely not welcomed. During the special performance at the worship service, a worship dance team, strategically formed at the time and centered around women, performed. As you know, the reaction was explosive. Unfortunately, however, simply because I was the president at the time, that days I ended up being forced to take on the design task. And the even more devastating fact is that the design sequence had to follow immediately after the worship team's special performance. I cannot forget the look in the soldiers' eyes at that time. I cannot forget the way they expressed their hostility with their whole bodies, as if I were a North Korean soldier, saying, why are you here taking our time? I usually don't think about things like that, but even now, it is one of the experiences I really want to forget, and I feel it was a truly shameful one. In fact, for me, it was an experience where I only had to endure for about 20 minutes. If you think about it, wasn't Ezekiel called to live a life like this his entire life? He was called to a life and ministry among congregations and people who did not welcome him, and to a life that seemed to bear no fruit at all. As I read this passage, 2 questions come to mind. No matter how much we say, as a slogan of faith, I am satisfied with God alone, Ezekiel was still human, so what could this calling possibly mean to him? What value could it have? That's what I wonder. And another question is, for us today who are reading this passage, how are we supposed to read this calling that seems like a summons to worthlessness? Those were my questions. And behind these questions, there was also my own urgent hidden thought. I have to preach about this. What am I supposed to say this week? If I were to tell the congregation, everyone, this is our calling, I feel like everyone would just run away. So what meaning and what value are contained within this calling? I held on to those kinds of questions and feelings. I was struggling with that frustration and those questions for several days, just reading chapter 2 over and over. And then as I looked at the expressions in chapter 3, some meaningful phrases caught my eye. I want to look at verses 7 to 9. Verse 7 once again describes the harsh reality that Ezekiel will face. It says this, "But the house of Israel will not be willing to listen to you, For they are not willing to listen to me, because all the house of Israel have a hard forehead and a stubborn heart. Then in verses 8 and 9, God gives Ezekiel strength or a promise, which is recorded there. Let's read it together in one voice. Behold, I have made your face as hard as their faces, and your forehead as hard as their foreheads. Like emery, harder than flint, have I made your forehead. What does this mean? God promises he will make Ezekiel's face and forehead strong and resilient. This is a divine assurance that he will sustain him and help him endure so that he won't easily collapse or give up. God does not promise Ezekiel success. He does not promise Ezekiel any extraordinary gifts to overcome every situation either. Rather, he promises to give him the strength to remain by his word until the end, so that his being will not collapse in a crumbling era. God is saying, "This is the power I will give you." Still, I felt a bit puzzled. Of all the abilities God could give, why would he give Ezekiel this one? As I meditated on this while thinking about his calling, this thought came to me. Perhaps our standards for calling and vocation are fundamentally different from God's standards. You see, without even realizing it, we may have long understood calling in terms of achievement. So when do we usually feel that we are living out a meaningful calling or vocation? It's often when we sense some visible change, when our actions and even our small or large attempts seem to have an impact on someone. It's when we feel that there is something special or outstanding within us. Only then do we tend to think that we are living within a meaningful and valuable calling. But if we look at it through this lens, no matter how many times we read Ezekiel chapters 2 and 3, God's calling of Ezekiel can only feel utterly meaningless. There is no immediate change or visible, meaningful fruit, and the ministry he is called to seems far from anything remarkable. However, if you set aside such preconceptions and read chapters 2 and 3 of today's passage carefully, you will see that from the very beginning, God consistently asks only one thing of Ezekiel: faithfulness. God never once calls Ezekiel to achieve any clear result or success. He does not command him to turn the situation around with outstanding ability or excellence, nor does he force him to break through this bleak situation and bear fruit at all costs. He simply asks him to remain close to his word and to be faithful in proclaiming it. Furthermore, he has graciously promised to provide us with the necessary strength to remain faithful in that way. Dear beloved congregation, I would like to take a moment to gently and carefully pose this question to you. Perhaps God has long been telling us that faithfulness alone is truly enough for our lives and our very existence. But have we not, by measuring and judging ourselves with the entirely incorrect and misleading standards of excellence, ability, and fruit, brought about our own sense of instability and eventual spiritual downfall? There is a book by James Davidson Hunter titled How Christianity Changes the World. In this book, he sharply points out and criticizes the contradiction that while Christianity attempted to change the world, it ultimately followed the very ways the world uses. For example, he notes that Christianity has long believed that seizing political power would change the world, or that climbing to a higher social position, status, or influence would allow it to move the world. However, no matter how good the intentions may have been, the church ultimately fell into a self-defeating trap in this entire process. It means that, identical to the grammar of the world, it came to worship the logic of power. It revered gathering more people and growing larger as power, sought to prove itself through influence, and fell into a contradiction of obsessing over efficiency and results themselves, even if packaged under the word fruit. He argues that in this process, Christianity has accumulated errors that have actually distanced it from the way of the cross, which involves love, service, and self-sacrifice, which it considers its true core. Based on this criticism, the author proposes an alternative theology, the concept of faithful presence. It is a concept. It means that we should set aside the impatient and grandiose ambition to change the world right now. It implies that it is okay if I do not create visible changes immediately, because that has always belonged to God's realm and his timeline. Faithful presence simply means being faithful in the place where God has placed us, trusting in his presence. This is true even if there are no visible changes, even if absolute influence does not appear to be radiating from me, and even if I do not possess any excellence that overwhelms others when I look at myself. It says that being present in that place without giving up, trusting in the God who placed me there, holding on to his companionship, is actually the power that brings about fundamental change. Everyone, God called Ezekiel in a broken era not to success or excellence, but to faithfulness. And I believe that he is inviting us today to the same calling, the same vocation for our existence and our lives. I think that all of you here have also been called by God to various forms of life. Some of you have been called to serve as church officers, some as small group leaders, some as teachers, and others as volunteers, serving in various ways. In the world, some have been called to be mothers or fathers, some as students, some as employees, some as professionals, and some as self-employed. There are many other callings that I cannot list here. As we try to live out and fulfill these callings, I too often experience this. We frequently feel broken-hearted, and we often feel small and discouraged. In relationships or in the tasks entrusted to us, even though we have tried our best, it sometimes seems like there is no meaningful change, and there are times when it feels like no one recognizes our efforts. When such times pile up, when it feels like I'm just running in place like a hamster on a wheel, when I compare myself to those around me, and my work and abilities seem so ordinary and insignificant, during these times and in these situations, when we encounter the words God's calling or vocation, do we perhaps feel more frustration or inferiority and end up deciding that these words do not suit us, as if they are something we have already failed at or missed, and choose to turn away from them? But the God who speaks in Ezekiel today seems to be saying this as he embraces all of our lives and existence. It's okay. He says, you are not lacking, nor is my calling mistaken or a failure. It's okay. Because from the very beginning, God never demanded or expected those things from us. And since it's okay, he simply asks us to be faithfully present in the place of our calling. He is telling us that even in the place where your heart has been broken, God's throne still remains and he is still with you. Just trust in that. Do not give up and simply remain faithfully. That is all he asks. Dear beloved congregation, there is a word of comfort from God for all those who respond to his calling. This is found in today's passage, Ezekiel chapter 2, verse 2. Let's read it together one more time, all in one voice. As he spoke to me, the Spirit entered into me and set me on my feet. It says that the Spirit of God, God's very presence, entered into Ezekiel and he set him on his feet. It specifically says he set him on his feet, on both feet. This expression is said to be a very unique one throughout the entire Bible, because usually it says the Spirit of God came upon him. The Word of God came to him. There are many such expressions, but the Spirit of God, his very presence, directly entered into the person. The phrase that he went deep inside and made him stand on both feet is a very rare expression. This shows just how powerful God's will and sovereignty are. So what do you think this means, everyone? It is a clear promise that in an era where everything is collapsing, God will powerfully be with you and walk with you so that even your very existence will not fall apart, and so that you can faithfully remain by his word. And it is a promise that whenever you are overwhelmed and fall, the Spirit of God will raise you up again and again, help you breathe again, and enable you to walk forward once more. I believe that this power of God, who wholeheartedly supports, encourages, and lifts up his people who have been called and have stepped out in faithfulness, is with you and me today in the same way. And there is yet another grace. As I mentioned, even if you read through the entire book of Ezekiel, it is difficult to find any expression that the exiled community directly repented, or that any dramatic, visible change occurred immediately as a result of Ezekiel's ministry. However, if you look at the history of Israel after Ezekiel from a broader perspective, the fruit of his lifelong ministry finally becomes clearly evident. In an era when everything had collapsed, Ezekiel, through God's visions, left behind new imaginations and languages that had never existed before. Words like the moving throne we heard about last week, the new heart and new spirit, dry bones coming to life, the restored temple, and the return of God's glory. These were languages that did not exist before Ezekiel and that no one could have imagined. These words did not fade away with the passage of time, but were planted in the hearts of later leaders and prophets. Thus, the seeds of the word sown through Ezekiel created the soil in which a completely new imagination could grow, even in an age when everything had collapsed and people were convinced it was the end and despaired. It made it possible to believe, no, in ways we could never have imagined before, God still walks with us and will grant us new restoration. And as we all know, on that very soil, the community that later returned from exile began a great awakening to rebuild the temple and restore the law, and started to reconstruct the broken walls. This was the fruit of Ezekiel's faithfulness, something that was not visible at the time, but which undoubtedly and brilliantly existed. Today is the seventh Sunday of Easter, as well as Youth Sunday. Therefore, I would like to conclude my message by sharing a brief final reflection on the grace of faithfulness that I experienced during my adolescence. When I was in middle school, I experienced a profound collapse of my entire world of faith. My father had been battling cancer for a long time. At that time, I had a framework of faith that I had learned and formed through Sunday school since I was young. It was the belief that God is a God of power, who grants whatever is asked of those who pray earnestly, with faith, and will heal. So, I remember that for about 3 years, starting from when my father was first diagnosed with cancer, I would kneel before going to bed every night and pray for my dad to be cured. However, in the winter of my second year of middle school, I ended up witnessing my father's passing. It was the first time I experienced the massive framework of faith that had supported my life and existence until then being shaken and crumbling in an instant. Looking back, I remember that disbelief and doubt. Questions like, does God really exist? Can God truly be called good? Or is he actually an insignificant and powerless being? Consumed my heart for a long time. I didn't realize it at the time, but looking back, I think there were situations where my life and very existence could have easily collapsed due to the deep religious skepticism and distrust I harbored, as well as my family's modest financial circumstances. However, when I reflect on my life and think about why I didn't collapse back then and was able to reach where I am today, there is just one thing I can say. It was because there was a community of faith during my adolescence that supported the weight of my life with their faithful presence. It was a very small rural church. There was a sincere and warm middle and high school community, and there were good teachers and good warriors. I apologize for saying this, but what is certain is that the ministers and teachers I met were far from excellent. That is because not a single word remains in my memory of what they preached or what was discussed during Sunday school every week, yet there is something that remains very vivid. The entire memory of those who faithfully stayed with me throughout all those times, that remains very vivid. Their faithful presence made me realize that God's companionship can be revealed in this way. God's living presence is God's. I believe that the word made me realize that he could come to me again among the audience in this way, and it seems to have very slowly restored my broken trust. Through their faithful presence, my teenage years, which were on the verge of collapse, were able to remain intact, and I cannot help but confess that the grace sown through their faithfulness has borne fruit within us, the undeniable mark of God. Beloved saints, we are living in an era where everything demands quick results. Consequently, it seems we too are sometimes influenced by the grammar of the world, becoming impatient, anxious, and prone to falling apart. However, through the book of Es today, God is encouraging us and speaking to us, telling us that we must and can live in a completely different way of being. He tells us that we do not need to prove our existence through success, that we are not beings loved for excellence. He tells us to simply remain by the word in the place where he has established us, not to give up on love, and to be faithfully present. Furthermore, he promises that whenever we are overwhelmed and collapse, the Spirit of God, the Holy Spirit, will enter into us, raise us up again, and enable us to walk. So trusting in that God, may all our beloved congregation members live their lives in the places given to them, taking quiet yet steadfast steps of faith with radiant faithfulness. I bless you in the name of the Lord. Let us pray together.